and methods for assessing suspected new invaders that you may run into. This is the fourth of our 5 sessions on early detection and rapid response. As you can see here, we have 5 total that we've developed, and we've done 4 already. Well, this will be number 4, and the one that's coming up in a couple of weeks will be the 5th one, which is on rapid response, which is basically you want to do all these things to get to the point that you can actually eradicate something. So what we're going to talk about today is how you make a decision whether you're going to go ahead with some kind of control or eradication strategy. This is also part of our overall series on invasive species. The other ones, we have a 9-part series on invasive species prevention, which is based on my work as a plant quarantine officer at the Port of Charleston early in my career. That's a 9-part series. This Thursday, we're going to be talking about decision-making tools like the International Plant Protection Convention, the kind of tools that actually give you authority to address quarantine significant pests at a port of entry. Then on the 25th of April, we'll finish up that 9-part series with a series summary and look at foreign pest exclusion as a major element of a national invasive species prevention strategy. As Steve said, there's a schedule that you can look at on the Invasive Plant Control website for when these are going to be offered, so you can register for them. And also the ones that have been recorded that were successful are listed there. There's a link to them, so you can go look at the ones that we have recorded and posted there. I'm coming to you today live from what I call the World Weed Center, and you may know this more as the Witchweed Research Lab. This was set up in 1959 by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to provide science support to the federal, state witchweed eradication program. So that's my office. I've been here for 27 years after leaving the Port of Charleston in 1986, still here. So this is a map of who you are, just so you can know that we're sort of gathered together. Our classroom today is the United States, the whole thing, and we have people from California to Pennsylvania. We have a guest from University of North Carolina, Wilmington, a graduate student. We have a number of people from Fish and Wildlife Service from around the country, and from Wisconsin DNR, Illinois Invasive Plant Task Force, and our regular guest from Swansea University, who is from Cardiff, Wales. So this will give you an idea of who is listening in today and what they might be thinking about. So we also want to welcome our Fish and Wildlife friend from Alamo in Texas. So this is, I think, the first time we've had someone from Fish and Wildlife Service down in Texas to join us. So welcome. So I wanted to start out by just giving you an overview, because some of you, I can see from the list, a lot of you are new, and exactly how we got to this new strategy of the landscape approach to early detection and rapid response. It starts with the single agency-led weed eradication programs in 1959, with witchweed eradication here in the Carolinas. And basically, these are state and federal noxious weeds, and they're basically run by a single agency or two. Usually the federal government and the state governments cooperate to run these programs, and witchweed was the first one in our modern weed control era. And a little bit later on, in the 1980s, after the Federal Noxious Weed Act was passed in 1974, for the species that were listed as federal noxious weeds, they decided to try to launch some weed eradication programs. That's what happened with a number of them we'll be talking about today. One was goat rue in 1981, and then Japanese dodder in 1991. Goat rue being in Cache County, Utah, and Japanese dollar being at the Clemson University Arboretum in 1991. In the late 90s, we got a lot of support from the national level, from our departments at the department level, and actually from the White House. And so they encouraged us back in those days to try to form partnerships around the country. And so that led to the establishment of a lot of the councils that many of you may know about, such as the Delaware Invasive Species Council that we helped to form in 1998, and which led to a number of task forces that were actually directly involved with weed eradication programs. And one of our most successful has been the Beach Vitex Task Force, which was formed in 2003, which has almost eradicated just about every beach vitex plant from the coast of South Carolina, and they're trying to do the same thing in North Carolina, and they're working on it in Virginia. So this is the interagency approach. And that led, after I retired last year, to a comment by Steve Manning, who suggested to me that maybe we could take these ideas and implement them at all levels of the landscape. So that's what we mean by the landscape approach to EDRR, is for every landowner at every level of the landscape to take responsibility for new weeds in the area that they manage. So whether it's the country, whether it's a state, county, city, whether it's roadways, right-of-ways, whether it's parks, forests, refuges, private lands, it doesn't matter. What I'm hoping will come out of the series is a new sense of urgency that we simply can't afford any more weeds. And whether they're regulated or not doesn't really matter to me anymore, because we're going to have regulated weeds and we're going to have things that are not regulated. If we only focus on the ones that are regulated, like hydrilla, then things like kudzu, which are too widespread to be regulated in most places, simply will not be addressed. That means we lose so many opportunities to protect the land that we manage. And if you think about a Fish and Wildlife Service refuge in Texas, and if kudzu or purple loosestrife shows up for the first time, it doesn't really matter whether it's being regulated by the state. You need to think of that piece of ground as something that you control. And you don't want kudzu or purple loosestrife or hydrilla or anything else there. So it's sort of taking personal responsibility in a way that we haven't for probably about 60 or 70 years, because I've got to tell you, EDRR is nothing new. My dad grew up in the Depression in upstate South Carolina, and he always talked about getting out there early to try to get ahead of those weeds, because he said you just couldn't afford to let them get established because they didn't have great chemicals and other methods like we do today. Well, this is what we're going to talk about is really nothing new. It's just something that we're trying to assert and imply that we ought to go back to this original very successful weed control strategy. So my question is for you folks today who are listening to this webinar, where do you fit in here? And if you've seen this slide before, I want you to think really hard all through this about where you are on this chart, because maybe you're at the state level. Like the folks from the Illinois Invasive Plant Task Force, they're thinking about what can we do on the local level and on the county level and in parks and throughout the state of Illinois to protect all these land units from new invaders. Since there are so many folks new, I want to stress something that I mentioned last week, and to introduce you to somebody if you don't already know him. Friend of mine, Jonathan Jones, who he and I went to school together, or University of South Carolina together in the mid-'70s, finished our master's degree there in biology under Dr. Wade Batson, who's the famous botanist who's about to turn 101 years old on May the 7th. And so John and I go back long, long ways. He started working in APHIS right after I did. I started in January of '79, and he started in July of '79 in Puerto Rico. And so he has been up in our national headquarters in APHIS since 1990, over 20 years. So we spent a lot of time up there. So now Al Tasker has moved on to another job up there, and so Jonathan Jones has assumed the responsibility as the APHIS National Weed Program Coordinator. He is a really great botanist, so I'm looking forward to working with him. And if you get a chance to see him somewhere and talk to him, I think you'll enjoy getting to know Jonathan, who's the new APHIS National Weed Program Coordinator up in Riverdale. When we started school in USC in the 70s, his dad was actually the president of the University of South Carolina, and then John and I went to all those classes together. I've known him forever. Not really ever worked with him directly because he's always been at headquarters and I've been out in the field. So just want to tell you about Jonathan Jones. He's taken Al Tasker's place. Well, we're going to talk about rapid assessment today, but I want to put it into context for all the other the seven strategies for building early detection capacity on the lands that you own or manage, and to talk about the IPC tools and services that are available to help you get organized to do that. So first thing you want to do is get organized and figure out who your stakeholders are, and we can help you make a work plan for your land unit or your state or your county, wherever you are. Once you do that, you need to develop an early detection network and make sure you do figure out how you're going to monitor the site or the area or the county, whatever it is, and then do continual monitoring through field surveys. And we have data collection guidelines that we can give. What has really changed all this for me and why I'm so excited now is that they have these smartphone apps, which means that you can collect your field data and archive it in an online system like the University of Georgia EDMAPS, Early Detection, Distribution, and Mapping System. Once you do that, IPC has smart tools to help you manage your projects. And Steve Manning actually has webinars that are devoted to this specifically. So if you want to hear about the smart tools that have been developed by the company over the past year or so, like IPC Connect, which is project management, IPC Logic, which gives you recommendations for actually controlling invasive plants in particular sites. Then IPC Prevent, which is where I'm going to take all the information that you're going to hear in these webinars and put it into a smart tool to help you develop your early detection capacity. Once you find something you think is suspicious, then you want to report it to somebody at the state level. So we have guidelines for that. And then if necessary, do a rapid assessment. And that will tell you whether you need to do rapid response. So these are the things I'm hoping you take away from my webinars. These are the 7 steps, not the details, but basically 1 through 7. If you do this, and we put it into practice with impacted and potential stakeholders, I think we could say there's not going to be any more new weeds. It won't get rid of kudzu, but it would make sure kudzu never became a problem on a new piece of ground. So, step 6 is to assess the problem. You want to conduct a rapid assessment to determine whether you've got a problem or not. And the one thing I want to encourage you to do, if you haven't already done it, is to get a copy of this book called the Global Compendium of Weeds. There is a URL where you can actually download this thing for free. It's not going to cost you anything. This book was written by, it's actually an online database now. It's written by Rod Randall, who is a weed geographer from the Western Australia Department of Agriculture in Perth. He's been working on this for about 20 years, and so far he has documented 33,759 weeds in the world worldwide. That means he has citations to prove they're all weeds. It's just not his point of view. So this is where you start to see this new species you may have found. The first thing I would do is to open up this publication, and it's online, and it's actually a PDF file. So I don't know that I will ever print the thing because I think it's probably about 1,200 pages. but it would sure be great to have on your computer so you can say, is this one of the 33,000 weeds that Rod Randall has documented? Okay. We have general guidelines for doing rapid assessments. Basically, what you want to do, if you already know something is a problem, then there's no reason to do a formal risk assessment. What I would suggest you do is a general rapid assessment. And so basically here it's like a 12-part report from identity, biology, ecology, current distribution, history of invasiveness. Basically, this tells you what you ought to put in your report so that if you have something like we do here at Lake Waccamaw, which is hydrilla, there's no reason to do an assessment, a formal assessment of hydrilla at Lake Waccamaw. What I originally did when we found hydrilla last fall at Lake Waccamaw was did a general report like this, so that when we had our meetings, people really didn't know anything about hydrilla. They knew it was a weed, aquatic weed. Then they, in this like 20-page report, they would be pretty much up to date on what this thing was, how it got here, how it is spread, why we should be concerned, and generally what we ought to do about it. So that's what I call a general rapid assessment for guidelines. Whenever we found beach vitex back in 1998, I was called by the Corps of Engineers, by Tommy Sosha, who was down in Charleston, dune restoration specialist, and he called and told me that there was this new plant that was spreading on the beaches around Myrtle Beach and Pawleys Island down to Georgetown in South Carolina on the beaches. And he was really concerned about it, so we went down and looked at it, and yeah, it looks like a weed. This is what we saw. The lower picture here is Pawleys Island. This is pretty much what we saw. This thing can spread up to 30 to 50 feet a year. So if you plant it on your lot right here, it's going to spread over to your neighbor in no time at all. And of course that causes lots of issues there. But anyway, I went back and called the folks up in Riverdale in our headquarters, and they had an interesting comment to me. They said, oh, that's interesting. We never heard of that, so what's the problem with it? And I told them, and they said, well, okay, here's the last question. Who besides you and Tommy Sosha cares about this? And this was something I had never heard before. I've been working on weeds a long time, but it actually sort of stopped me and made me think about the stakeholders that need to be involved in this. And this is something that APHIS is always include in their program. So they don't just do projects on their own. They're always involved with stakeholders who have something to lose. It makes a lot of sense, actually. So I couldn't answer that question. And so I couldn't answer that question for years because I never heard about it again until 2003. In 2003, this lady who's a sea turtle volunteer named Betsy Brabson called me up in August 2003, almost 5 years to the day that I heard from Tommy. And she said, there's this weed down here and nobody will do anything about it, and it's a threat to sea turtle reproduction. So we heard you might be able to help us. And so that really began the process of creating the Carolinas Beach Vitex Task Force. We knew that a single agency was not going to do this because it's not an agricultural weed, it's not an aquatic weed, it just doesn't fit anywhere. And so we formed this task force, and when we went down and looked at it again, I could see that it was starting to actually, as we say, naturalize. It was making seeds and spreading. So we formed this task force, and it's been extremely successful. So I did an assessment using the original APHIS weed risk assessment process. I think it's been replaced now. But basically this thing is based on likelihood of introduction, consequences of introduction, and overall pest potential. And so this thing came out pretty high on the scale. And normally it would be listed as a federal noxious weed just based on that. Turns out, though, that there's something about the Plant Protection Act, and at that time the Federal Noxious Weed Act, which basically said that if a plant is native to the United States, we're not going to list it. In other words, we're not going to regulate native species, and I understand that. It's the problem with this is that it is said to be native to Hawaii. Of course, that's a United States. It's a state of our country. Only problem is it's 2,400 miles offshore. You can have something native to Mexico, and you can regulate it, like right 10 feet away, technically, I guess. But something in that is native to Alaska or Hawaii or Puerto Rico, they're our territories or our states, and you can't regulate it. The problem I have with this is it's an issue with the law. So they couldn't list it. So the law says that you can't regulate a native species, but I would say that anything that is native to Korea can't also be native to Hawaii. That's just my personal opinion. Well, my opinion, as you know, didn't go too far, and so we never regulated it as a federal noxious weed. We did list it using the same assessment process, and if you want a copy of it, I'd be glad to send you a copy of the assessment I did. No problem. It's a Word document. I still have it. I did it in 2006, and they actually used it to list this as a state noxious weed in North Carolina. In certain counties of North Carolina, in the coastal counties, not in all the 100 counties we have here. It has never been listed as a noxious weed in South Carolina because the landscape and nursery industry really rebelled and said, we sell this thing up around Columbia and in Greenville up in the mountains, and we don't think it's a problem there, so why don't you do something else? And so essentially what's happened in South Carolina is we have a number of local ordinances which prohibit this being grown in towns along the coast, and actually Georgetown County, which is north of Charleston, they have an ordinance you can't plant it in the county. So even though it's not a state noxious weed or a federal noxious weed, we do have local status as a noxious weed in most all of the coastal counties of South Carolina. So that's been an interesting process, and it also goes to show why sometimes you need you need a task force to deal with these kind of things, because we ended up having about 15 agencies involved with this, and it's been very successful because everybody had something to bring to the table. And it wasn't so much about money as it was that the Fish and Wildlife Service sometimes provided money, the NRCS provided money, APHIS provided a little bit of money at one point through their federal noxious weed program. Excuse me, I'm sorry, they did not provide money. It was not a federal noxious weed. They couldn't, but they were very supportive in every other way in terms of supporting what we were doing and giving us help, except as far as money goes and regulations. And so we have made it through the process. Now in Virginia, they listed it as a state noxious weed, and in Virginia, it's a state noxious weed all over the state, not just in the coastal counties. And the reason they did that was they said, well, if we let them grow it in Richmond, then maybe they have a beach house down near Norfolk somewhere, and they let this thing, and they decided to take it there. How are we going to practically regulate this thing? In other words, regulate the movement of it? And the answer is you can't. So it does make sense that I think Virginia had the best answer to this. So far, we haven't seen a problem with it being listed in a few counties in North Carolina, and we're on track to eradicate it after a few more years here from North Carolina. So the other formal risk assessment system that I've always enjoyed working with is the Australian Quarantine Inspection Service system. It was created by a fellow named Paul Fallon, P-H-E-L-O-U-N-G, from Canberra, the capital of Australia, and about the mid-90s. And this thing has 49 questions, and for each question you answer yes or no, you get a score of like 1 or 2 or something like that. If you get a score of less than 1 on this thing, they say that's okay. This is a permitted listing system as opposed to the prohibited listing system that we have in the United States. The really good news is that APHIS a year or so ago, changed the regulations of Quarantine 37, which regulates the importation of plants for planting, so that if there is a history of problems with a plant that someone wants to import, they can require that you do an assessment like this. And I think the new assessment is similar to the Australian system. I haven't actually looked at it and used it, but I think if it's like the Australian system, it's going to be a lot easier to use. I know the Beach Vitex assessment I did in 2006 took a couple of weeks. And this one right here, if you have all the information, can be done fairly rapidly. So I'm excited that APHIS has decided to do basically a permitted listing system for plants for planting. And if you think about it, this book that Rod Randall has written, The Global Compendium of Weeds, so if somebody wants to import something, really that's the master list right now. I don't know how many weeds there are in the world, but it's 33,759 and counting. Maybe in another 100 years we'll come up with 50,000, I don't know. Maybe we're near the end. This is what's been spread around so far. But remember, there are hundreds of thousands of plants, vascular plants, and so there's a lot more out there that could come here. So I wanted to end this thing by giving you some good examples of what I call opportunities lost. And I want to take you back to when these things were first introduced into the country. And I want you to think about what you would say right now if you could send a message by email back to the Philadelphia Centennial and to these other places when they were starting to import these plants. The first one I wanted to mention to you was kudzu, which was brought in by the folks. They had an exposition at the Philadelphia Centennial at our 100th anniversary of the founding of our country in Philadelphia in 1876. And they imported this as a porch vine, and you know all the history of kudzu, so I'm not going to tell you all about it except to say that here we are in 2009, and we have an area from really New York down to East Texas, where we have about 5 million acres of kudzu, and they were thinking that several years ago, maybe 15 years ago, that it might grow up as far as Lake Erie. Well, if you look right here at this little point of land right here, which is on this map right there, that's Leamington. And if you ever go on an airplane from Atlanta to Detroit, you're going to fly over this area right here. You're going to fly over this island. I don't know the name of this island, but you're going to see it. You're looking out the window, and I swear it is like looking at this map right here, except a lot closer. You can look down and actually see this point of land coming out. It's pretty amazing when you see something at 30,000 feet, and you look down and say, I have seen this before on a map. Anyway, knowing that kudzu showed up here in 2009, right here where Leamington is, and this is what it looks like, and there's really a couple of acres there. And I've been encouraging them for about 2 years to get in gear and do something about this, because with climate change coming, with things getting warmer, there is no doubt in my mind that kudzu is going to get established in Canada and keep on spreading. There's no reason why it can't. And so the only question is, how much longer are you going to wait before you regulate this thing and make sure nobody at least plants it on purpose? They get some bright idea up there. In 1891, there was a professor at Utah State University who wanted to import a new plant called goat's rue. It's a legume, sort of like alfalfa. And so he brought it in and created some test plots. He thought this would be good because it's so dry out there that it would grow in rangelands and make some good cattle forage. Well, he found out pretty fast after doing his test, or during his test, that it was poisonous to cows, and so they abandoned the research plots. And so you can see where it's been documented here in very northern Utah in Cache County. So we had this thing just grew and grew from the 1890s until 1970, when Dr. Jack Evans here who became a weed scientist at Utah State, when he got involved with controlling this thing. And it was listed as a federal noxious weed in 1976 with the original list of 26 federal noxious weeds. And we started a weed eradication program for it in 1981. So literally 90 years from the time that it was introduced until we started eradicating it, it just grew and grew and grew. So that's 90 years. So I want you to think about, if you could send an email back to that guy at Utah State in 1891, what would you say to him? You could do an assessment. You could send it to him and say, don't. And it's too bad that we can't go ahead and do stuff, and people can't send us emails from the year 2213 and say, 200 years ago, this is what you did with, or didn't do with, crested floating heart in Lake Marion, South Carolina, or hydrilla. So I think that we're at each moment in time, all of us, and we have this responsibility. We can't change the past, but we can sure make a difference on what happens in the future. The third one I want you to look at is nutria. Does anybody like Tabasco sauce? I like hot sauce on all my food, and so the McElhaney family in every island in Louisiana got a bright idea that they didn't want to just grow red hot peppers down here on this island in Louisiana in 1899. They wanted to import this critter from South America and sell the pelts, the fur, and the rest is history there. So it's become a big problem down in the Gulf Coast area. It is a pretty big problem up in Maryland too, and it's spreading down along the coastal area. And we actually have a really nice mount here that we got from over near in Pender County, over here near Wilmington, where a fellow had shot this one. It was eating his flower beds, so we had it mounted. So this is what one of the best mounts that I've ever seen of a nutria. Because if you look at this, you can't really tell a whole lot about the thing. This is what give you a real good idea of what this big rat looks like. So my question is, what would you say to the McElhaneys in 1899 if you could do a risk assessment now and just send it back to them and say, would you please stop, don't do this, and here's why? Because here's what's going to happen over the next 120 years if you do. And maybe they would say, this is ridiculous. They're going to go ahead and do it anyway. But it would sure be nice. Cogon grass was imported into Alabama in 1911. It was actually a hitchhiker. It was used originally in packing for some shipments that came into Mobile, Alabama in 1911, and later actually it was imported on purpose as a grass, as a forage grass, and it turned out this is one of our worst weeds of the South. And the reason it's so bad is it crowds out everything, and it creates such hot fires that it will literally kill these pine trees. So not only will nothing else grow there but the grass and the tree, but it creates these fires in the wintertime that nothing can survive, even these pine trees that are 20 or 30 years old. So what would you say to the people who wanted to bring this in the 1920s on purpose? Exactly what would you say? Hydrilla was introduced in 1947 by a fellow named Otto von Linn. Otto von Linn was over visiting in Ceylon on that island over there east of Africa, which is now Sri Lanka. And he saw this plant, and he brought it back with him as a water garden plant into St. Louis in 1947. So if you were a customs official then, or a plant quarantine official, let's say at the Port of New York, and you saw this fellow coming in with a bucket with this stuff in it, or with some kind of package or bag or something like that, and you say, what is that? Well, this is hydrilla, and they don't even have a law to do anything about it. But what could you do? What would you say now if you could go back and talk to Otto von Linn? He sent this. It didn't grow well in St. Louis when he took it back home, and so he sent it to a friend in Tampa who is a water garden dealer, and the rest is history there. So now we're up to 2012 when we have found hydrilla in Lake Waccamaw, which is about excuse me, it's about 20 miles southeast of here. 9,000 acre lake. First time we've ever had anything like this in here. This is our biggest natural Carolina Bay between New Jersey and Florida, 9,000 acres. Beautiful lake. It has a number of endemic species such as the Waccamaw silverside minnow that grow nowhere else in the world. And so we found that we had about 1,000 acres of hydrilla last fall. And so now we're going through a process of figuring out how to get the local folks to come up with some money to match what it's going to take to control it for the next 10 or 15 years, which is $450,000 a year. And of all things I could say to you today, folks, I want you to look at this figure, these two figures that I've given you today. And I want you to pass these on. We're going to have to spend $450,000 a year to deal with this problem, which if we had had a prevention program in place, a monitoring program in place for the last 5 years, somebody sees hydrilla on a boat trailer going into the lake. And then they go out there and they clean the boat, and that's all there is to it. And now, because we didn't do that, this is what's happening. It's an opportunity cost that we simply can't afford. Put that in the context with the fact that this is one of 33,759 species that are in the world. And I've been working on this for a long time, and I hope you all take me very seriously. I would be happy to talk about this to you personally. But this really bothers me that we have so many other possibilities like this right here. And we're not doing a whole lot about it in terms of preventing the introduction of new things. We have about 200 federal noxious weeds that are listed. It's a very tedious process to list it, as you can see. And so that is why I am focusing with Steve on EDRR, because we can't stop all these things from coming in, but we're sure all of you are involved with land management in some way or water management in some way. You have some opportunities here to do things where you are. No matter what they do in the state of Maryland, the folks with the U.S. Navy that are with us today, you have some things you can do to help us make sure we don't get zebra mussel in this country spread everywhere from the Great Lakes, and that we don't get killer shrimp, which is causing such big problems in England right now, in freshwater, coming over here into the Potomac River. Killer shrimp. Look it up. I don't have a picture of it today. Common cropina was probably brought in here accidentally by some sheep herders in the 1950s, because they did some land surveys in the 50s in which it was in the areas later where it showed up in the 1980s, and it wasn't there in the 50s. This thing was first actually identified near Grainesville, Idaho in 1968, and they did a survey in 1970 and found out they had 40 acres infested. It was listed as a federal noxious weed in 1981, and I remember because I was there and helped them write the short paragraph, and we didn't do a formal risk assessment. At that time, it simply had to be not native to the United States, of significance as far as a noxious weed someplace else, and it was either not here or it was not very widespread and could be eradicated. And that was pretty much it. We didn't do a real formal risk assessment. And so it was listed as a federal noxious weed. And then in 1982, they started an eradication feasibility study at the University of Idaho. Anyway, so by the time they finished that project in 1991, we had gone from 23,000 acres infested to 63,000 acres infested. And so my point of all this is that if you could go back to when it was first surveyed in 1970, that would be the opportunity. Now the folks in the Northwest, including our guest today from Marion County Public Works Department in Salem, Oregon, they're going to be dealing with common cropina because we missed that opportunity. We missed that opportunity. There's no known biological control agent either. So this is a question of whether this is going to be worse than yellow star thistle. And I don't know which is going to be worse over the next 100 years. But the only thing that's going to replace yellow star thistle, which is one of the baddest weeds I know, is going to be something worse than that. And I don't know, when they duke it out, I don't know which is going to be worse, Carpena or yellow star thistle in Oregon and Idaho. Have you heard about Gambian pouch rat? It was imported by some pet dealers into South Florida Keys, into the big, Grassy Key was the name of the island, down there about halfway down to Key West. And they wanted to use it as an exotic pet. And I first heard about this from Michael Lusk, who's now the refuge manager with the Crystal River Refuge near Tampa, Florida, where all the manatees overwinter every year. But Michael used to be our invasive species coordinator for Fish and Wildlife Service in Arlington for about 6 years. And I was including him in my online classes, which I'd like to talk to you about some other time, my online invasive species management classes that are offered through the college here. But anyway, I was featuring his program in one of my classes and asked him to send me a picture. And this is a picture he sent me. And I called him and I said, Michael, what in the world are you holding? I thought, is this a possum or something like that? He said, this is a Gambian pouch rat. Well, this was imported by these folks, and it was beginning to spread about 2006 and 7. And so APHIS started cooperating with the state of Florida to eradicate this thing, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because this is a serious threat to citrus production right up here. Now, a lot of effort has gone into eradicating this thing, and I think they will eradicate it. It's not huge infestation. But the point of this is, what would you do? What would you say to these people that actually are still in South Florida who brought this thing in before it was listed officially under the Lacey Act that you can't bring this thing in anymore? Okay, it's already here and it's loose. This is an example of an organism that is bad here but it's good somewhere else. And this thing can be taught and trained to find landmines. You can sniff them out, and that's what they use it for in Africa where it's native to. And it also can be taught to find other diseases by sniffing the spit from people, the saliva from people. So in Africa, this is regarded as just a wonderful creature. In Florida, we don't need it. We don't want it. It should have never come here. So if we had done an assessment in 1999 when they wanted to bring it in, there's no doubt in my mind this would not be here today. These assessments are so critical to help us prevent the introduction of this tsunami, basically a biological tsunami that is coming at us one or two at a time. And it happens over a period of years and decades instead of a few hours or minutes or seconds, the way it does with a tsunami like the one in Japan. So it's not treated as a natural disaster. But this is a natural disaster over time and space. If you could compress 500 years down into 2 minutes, you would see it'd be just like a regular tsunami. So get organized. Develop an early detection network, do surveys, report your findings, manage your field data, tell somebody, assess the problem, take action. You can do this in an in-house program with volunteers and dedicated staff, or you can outsource it to a company like ours, like Invasive Plant Control. So I want you to look at this for a second, and if you see anything new, I want you to think about what you can do to prevent the establishment of something, so you draw a line in the sand and say, nothing new in Illinois, nothing new in Marion County, nothing new in the hulls of ships with ballast water, nothing new in a refuge in Texas, nothing new. So I want to invite you to listen to some of Steve's presentations that he gives, the good webinars that talk about these SMART tools, because I really think if you're a land manager, I was listening to Steve talk to a lady in Saskatchewan yesterday, and it was pretty amazing that they were talking about roadside weed management and all these districts up there, and it was just amazing to listen to him talk about how these tools could be used to manage the information and how she could know exactly what's been treated that morning. She would know it by lunchtime by having these tools. It is pretty amazing, and if you haven't heard him talk about this, I want to encourage you to do that. Sign up for one of his webinars soon, and stay tuned because we're going to have EDRR SMART tools very soon. So join us for our next webinar. It is Thursday, if you have time. This is decision-making tools for addressing quarantine significant pests at ports of entry, and that will be at noon. And then on the 23rd, we'll have our final EDRR webinar in this series on rapid response. And then we'll finish out this 14-part series on April 25th. So I just want you to remember this figure. If you remember nothing else I said today, remember this one, write it down, 32,459. That's what we don't have. That's what we're going to get if we don't do something about it. If we either keep them out or we find them before they get established, like Crested Floating Heart has done in Lake Marion, South Carolina. And Steve, that's it for today.
All right. Well, thank you, Randy. Please join us for the webinars coming up on Thursday if you can. And everyone have a good day. Thanks.